Usually when you think about your body's alarm systems, you think of, things that are completely impossible to ignore.
Right, the loud ones.
Exactly. Like you twist your ankle on a run, and within an hour, it is visibly swollen, it's red, and it's just throbbing.
Oh, yeah. Or you get a paper cut and it stings immediately.
Yeah, the signal is loud, it is obvious, and it basically forces you to drop everything and pay attention to a physical breach.
Well, and that sensation of pain and swelling is actually a brilliantly evolved command to, you know, stop moving, protect the injured area, and just let your localized defense system do its job.
But the most dangerous alarm system in the human body isn't loud at all. I mean, it is entirely invisible.
Which is terrifying when you really dig into it.
It really is.
Yeah.
So our mission today is parsing through a massive stack of medical history, pathology reports, and clinical research, all centered around this idea of chronic inflammation.
We're basically unpacking exactly what happens when your body's defense system just fundamentally refuses to quit.
Right. And the wildest part found in all these sources is that this invisible systemic version of a twisted ankle is actively driving the world's leading causes of death.
We are looking at a really profound shift in how modern science understands disease. I mean, the very definition of inflammation has morphed over the centuries.
It sparked these huge historical debates, right? Debates that fundamentally shaped modern medicine.
Absolutely. And understanding the devastating consequences of what happens when that healing process fails is, well, it's arguably the most important key to understanding your own health, longevity, and disease risk.
Okay, so to understand what goes wrong with chronic inflammation, I feel like we first have to look at the blueprint of what it looks like when it goes right.
That makes sense. Because inflammation itself isn't the villain here.
Right, it's a lifesaver.
Yeah.
I like to think of acute inflammation like an emergency sprinkler system in your house.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, so say there's a grease fire in the kitchen. The sprinklers go off. The response is fast. It is incredibly messy. The drywall gets completely soaked, but it saves the house from burning to the ground.
And then you clean up the water and you move on.
Exactly. But chronic inflammation is what happens when those kitchen sprinklers just keep running for years. Eventually, the water rots the floorboards and compromises the entire foundation of the house.
That is exactly what happens on a cellular level. The architecture of that response is so fascinating when we look at the first principles in the pathology texts.
So what does the initial helpful response actually look like mechanically?
Well, acute inflammation is heavily engineered to be this fast, self-limiting emergency response. Within hours of an injury or an infection, local blood vessels dilate.
They open up.
Right, and they become highly permeable or leaky, which allows these first responder white blood cells called neutrophils to just flood the site.
And that flood of fluid and immune cells is what causes the symptoms we can actually see in the mirror, right?
Exactly. Way back in the 1st century CE, the Roman Encyclopaedia Celsus actually mapped out the 4 cardinal signs of this acute response.
The 1st century, wow.
Yeah, they knew what to look for even then. He called them rubor, which is redness, calor, which is heat, tumor, which is swelling, and dolor, pain.
Rubor, calor, tumor, dolor. Got it.
And centuries later, a 5th sign was added, functiolesa, or loss of function. That classification is credited in some sources to the Greek physician Galen, and in others to the 19th century German pathologist Rudolf Virchow.
So they've known the symptoms forever. But the arrival of those neutrophils to kill the invaders, that's only half the story, isn't it?
Right, because the truly crucial mechanism is that the response actively resolves.
The sprinklers have a programmed shutoff valve.
Yes. And this shutoff isn't just, the immune system getting tired and fading away. It's an active, distinct biological process.
Meaning the body is actively doing work to stand down.
Precisely. It's mediated by specific molecules with names like resolvins and lipoxins. Their entire job is to halt the inflammatory cascade once the threat is neutralized.
So how do the cleanup cells know to stop attacking and start cleaning?
Researchers describe this through something called macrophage polarization. Macrophages are the cleanup cells, and they make a critical transition.
Okay, what kind of transition?
They switch from an M1 state, which is the aggressive pro-inflammatory attacker mode, into an M2 state, which is the repair-oriented anti-inflammatory healer mode.
M1 attacks, M2 heals.
Exactly. They clear away the debris, and the tissue heals in a matter of days.
But when we look at the chronic version, something in that transition is breaking down.
The off switch completely fails. The resolution step just doesn't happen because the trigger refuses to leave.
So what kind of triggers are we talking about here?
Well, maybe the body is dealing with a bacterium it can't quite clear. Or it could be a continuous metabolic irritant, like excess visceral fat.
So because the threat persists, the body just keeps sending troops.
Right, but it actually changes the deployment.
Hmm.
Instead of fast-acting neutrophils, it recruits a steady stream of macrophages, lymphocytes, and plasma cells.
And because those macrophages are stuck in that aggressive M1 state, they never flip into the M2 healer mode.
You've got it. So the tissue gets trapped in this really destructive loop. The body is simultaneously trying to destroy the offending agent and trying to repair itself at the exact same time.
Wow, so they're just fighting each other.
Yeah, these two processes actively interfere with each other. Over months or years, the physical consequence of this biological tug of war is progressive fibrosis.
Which is permanent scar tissue.
Right. Fibrosis is the replacement of functional healthy tissue with stiff, non-functional scar tissue.
That sounds awful.
It is. This is the structural fingerprint of chronic inflammation. It really distinguishes it from the fully reversible damage of an acute response. The tissue is permanently remodeled.
I have to push back on the terminology a bit here, though.
Okay, go for it.
If chronic inflammation eventually causes permanent tissue scarring, how is it possible that millions of people, maybe even you listening right now, are walking around with it and have absolutely no idea?
That's the invisible part we mentioned earlier.
Right. But if there's no redness, no heat, no swelling, and no pain, how can the medical community even call this inflammation? I mean, it sounds like a completely different biological disease.
Well, pathologists debated that exact premise for most of the 20th century. The medical consensus used to view chronic inflammation merely as a failed, extended version of acute inflammation.
So they just thought it was a cut that wouldn't close.
Exactly. They thought of it strictly as a draining wound that wouldn't heal. The medical community didn't really recognize a second, entirely distinct category of chronic inflammation until a massive paradigm shift in the 1990s and 2000s.
The silent fire.
Exactly. Low-grade, subclinical, systemic chronic inflammation.
That's a mouthful. So there's no acute phase at all.
None. There is no initial paper cut, no localized infection, and no visible injury. Because it operates entirely below the threshold of pain, you just can't feel it.
So how do we even know it's there?
Doctors can only detect it through blood biomarkers. They specifically track proteins produced by the liver, like C-reactive protein, or CRP, and cytokines like interleukin-6 or IL-6.
It's just wild to think that even 30 years ago, this broader systemic definition wasn't standard curriculum in medical schools.
What's fascinating here is that pioneers in immunology had to invent an entirely new vocabulary for it.
Like what?
Well, in the early 2000s, the immunologist Gökhan Hottamyslugal coined the term metaflammation.
Like metabolic inflammation.
Yes, exactly. He used it to describe the invisible inflammatory state linked specifically to metabolic overload and obesity.
Oh, okay.
And around the exact same time, the Italian immunologist Claudio Franceschi coined the term inflammaging.
Inflammaging. I love that term. So what does that mean exactly?
He was describing the systemic, low-grade inflammation that seems inexplicably linked to the aging process itself, running parallel to something called immunosenescence.
I mean, immunosenescence being the natural decline of the immune system as we get older?
Right. The immune system gets simultaneously weaker at fighting off novel infections, but much more stubbornly active in creating this low-grade baseline of systemic inflammation.
Man, inflammaging is such a brilliant, if slightly depressing, term.
It really paints a picture.
It does. But to really figure out how science learned to measure and eventually treat this invisible fire, we have to look back at the pioneers who first realized the immune system was made of individual cells rather than, mystical fluids.
The shift from humors to cells.
Yes. There is this incredible story in the sources from 1882 in Messina, Italy. A Russian-born zoologist named Elie Mechnikov is staring at transparent starfish larvae under a microscope.
He was actually studying embryology, but he ended up observing the fundamental mechanism of cellular immunity.
Just by accident.
Wow.
So he takes a tiny splinter, literally just a thorn from a tangerine tree, and he sticks it into these transparent starfish larvae.
Which is brilliant because they're transparent.
Right. Because they're transparent, he can watch the internal reaction in real time. He sees these mobile cells inside the starfish actively rush over, surround the splinter, and begin engulfing the debris.
He discovers phagocytosis.
He realizes that these specialized cells, which he named phagocytes, and which we now know as macrophages and neutrophils, are the immune system's active front line.
And Mechnikov's discovery built on a radical idea proposed a few decades earlier by Rudolf Virchow.
Virchow, the guy who helped name the loss of function symptom.
The very same. In 1858, Virchow published Cellular Pathology, basically arguing that disease had to be understood at the level of the individual cell.
So he was openly rejecting the ancient humors theory.
Entirely. He rejected the dogma that disease was just an imbalance of blood, phlegm, and bile. And Virchow was so observant that in 1863 he made a staggering intuitive leap.
What did he see?
He noticed white blood cells, leukocytes, infiltrating tumor tissue under his microscope. So he speculated that cancer might actually arise at sites of chronic irritation and inflammation.
A hunch in 1863 that wouldn't be definitively proven until the late 20th century? That is insane.
It really is.
But even with the starfish experiment, the medical establishment didn't just immediately accept that cells were the body's defenders. Right?
Oh, not at all. Metchnikoff's discovery sparked one of the most intense scientific feuds of the late 19th century.
Because he championed the cellular theory of immunity.
Right. And his primary rival was the brilliant German chemist Paul Ehrlich, who championed the humoral theory.
And what did Ehrlich think was happening?
Ehrlich argued that circulating antibodies in the fluid of the blood, not the cells themselves, were the primary defense against disease.
It was a massive scientific turf war.
It was. But the resolution is a perfect template for understanding the sheer complexity of the immune system.
Which is that they were both right.
Exactly. Both are right. The immune system requires both the cellular troops to engulf debris and the antibody artillery to neutralize pathogens.
And didn't they both win a Nobel for that?
They did. This duality was formally recognized when Metchnikoff and Ehrlich jointly shared the 1908 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine.
Okay, so knowing that white blood cells exist is one thing, but proving Virchow's 1863 hunch proving that chronic inflammation actually causes disease rather than just showing up at the scene of the crime, that required some dramatic modern science.
It really did.
And the medical establishment had some major blind spots here, starting with the stomach.
Right, the ulcer debate. So in 1984, Australian physicians Barry Marshall and Robin Warren were trying to convince the world that stomach ulcers were caused by a spiral bacterium called Helicobacter pylori.
H. pylori. But the prevailing medical dogma firmly held that ulcers were simply the result of stress, excess acid, or, spicy food.
Yeah, the establishment thought Marshall and Warren were basically fringe lunatics.
Which leads to my favorite part. Unable to get his own colleagues to listen, Barry Marshall brews up a broth of cultured H. pylori bacteria and he just drinks it.
Which is an incredibly dangerous way to bypass the peer review process.
Seriously. But it worked. Within days, he developed severe acute gastritis. He proved unequivocally that the bacterium could colonize a healthy human stomach and trigger acute inflammation.
And that stunt ultimately earned them the 2005 Nobel Prize.
But the real revelation in the context of chronic inflammation is what happens when that infection is ignored, right?
Exactly. If H. pylori is left untreated, the acute phase shifts into a chronic sequel. It causes decades of low-grade, persistent gastric inflammation.
And that leads back to Virchow's hunch about cancer.
Yes. Researchers eventually proved that this relentless inflammatory state measurably raises the risk of gastric cancer and malt lymphoma.
So the continuous cycle of tissue damage and attempted repair is inherently carcinogenic.
It is one of the cleanest mechanistic demonstrations in modern medicine, proving Virchow's century-old hypothesis once and for all.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The medical world made the exact same mistake with the heart.
Ah, yes, atherosclerosis.
Right. For decades, the model for heart disease was basically treating the arteries like kitchen pipes. You eat too much cholesterol, it acts like grease, it clogs the pipe, and you have a heart attack.
But that passive plumbing model dominated cardiology until a vascular biologist named Russell Ross reinvigorated the field with his response to injury hypothesis.
Response to injury? What does that mean for the artery?
He demonstrated that heart disease begins with an injury to the inner lining of the artery. LDL cholesterol then infiltrates the vessel wall.
Okay, so the cholesterol gets inside the wall itself.
Right, and once inside, the cholesterol undergoes oxidative stress, which is a state of chemical imbalance that severely damages cellular structures.
And the immune system senses that oxidized, damaged cholesterol as a foreign invader.
Exactly. The cellular cleanup crew rushes in. Macrophages arrive to eat the oxidized cholesterol. But they consume so much of it that they become swollen, highly toxic entities known as foam cells.
Foam cells? That doesn't sound good.
It's not. These foam cells don't clear the injury. They undergo necrosis. They essentially die there and become the actual building blocks of arterial plaque.
So heart disease is an active, chronic inflammatory disease happening inside the vessel wall, silently, for decades.
Yes, and cardiologist Paul Ridker put that exact theory to the ultimate test. In 2008, his Jupiter trial followed nearly 18,000 participants.
And what did they find?
The data revealed that statin therapy reduced cardiovascular events, even in patients who had completely normal cholesterol levels, provided that their CRP, that biomarker for inflammation we talked about, was elevated.
Oh, wow. So statins were heavily damping down inflammation, not just lowering lipids.
Exactly. But the skeptics argued that maybe the inflammation drop was just a side effect of the drugs. Ridker had to prove that targeting the immune system directly would stop a heart attack.
So how did he do that without touching cholesterol?
That led to the CANTOS trial in 2017, involving about 10,000 patients. They used a biologic drug called canakinumab. Right. And canakinumab does absolutely nothing to cholesterol. It solely blocks a specific inflammatory cytokine called IL-1 beta.
And did it work?
It did. The results showed a significant reduction in heart attacks and strokes. It was the first direct, undeniable proof that targeting inflammation independent of cholesterol prevents cardiovascular events.
That is huge. But that structural damage isn't just limited to soft tissue and blood vessels, right?
No, not at all.
Because when we look at rheumatoid arthritis, the chronic inflammation in the joint lining produces a destructive runaway overgrowth of tissue called a pannus.
Right, the canis.
And it literally erodes cartilage and bone.
It's devastating. And rheumatoid arthritis introduces the concept of autoimmunity. The adaptive immune system basically gets confused and launches a highly specific attack against the body's own joint tissue.
Which is different from autoinflammatory diseases, right?
It's very different. Autoinflammatory diseases are rarer conditions where the innate immune system misfires generically, causing fever and inflammation without a specific target.
Got it. So for rheumatoid arthritis, how did they treat it before modern biologics?
For decades, the only tools doctors had were broad-spectrum steroids.
Which means the disease just guaranteed permanent disability.
Unfortunately, yes. Until researchers identified a specific signaling molecule, a cytokine called tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF-alpha.
TNF-alpha?
Yes. They realized TNF-alpha was the central driver keeping the chronic inflammatory cycle spinning in those joints.
So they made a drug to block it.
Exactly. The introduction of TNF-alpha inhibitors in the late 1990s, drugs like etanercept and infliximab, absolutely revolutionized rheumatology.
So by snipping that specific molecular wire, they transformed a perpetually disabling disease into one that can frequently achieve long-term remission.
It was a massive victory.
But this raises a really obvious question for you listening. If we know that inflammation causes stomach cancer, drives heart attacks, and destroys joints, why don't we just suppress it in everybody? I mean, why aren't we all taking anti-inflammatory biologics to live longer?
Well, this raises an important question about safety. Because tampering with an alarm system that took millions of years of evolution to perfect carries catastrophic risks.
It feels like trying to defuse a bomb. You want to snip the wire that stops the explosion, but if you're not incredibly careful, you accidentally cut the wire that powers the entire building's life support system.
That is a perfect analogy. The sources detail major controversies that serve as stark cautionary tales regarding unintended consequences.
The Vioxx disaster.
Yes, the Vioxx disaster of 2004 is a prime example. Vioxx was a COS2 inhibitor designed in the 1990s as a revolutionary painkiller.
What was it supposed to do differently?
The goal was to create an NSAID-like ibuprofen, but one that selectively spared the stomach lining from ulcers.
And it was an absolute blockbuster drug, right? It worked beautifully for pain and joint inflammation.
It did. But long-term data revealed a terrifying side effect. The manufacturer, Merck, had to abruptly withdraw it from the market because long-term use roughly doubled the risk of heart attack and stroke.
Doubled it. That is wild.
The irony is agonizing. A drug meticulously built to fight inflammation, which drives heart disease, ended up directly causing cardiovascular events.
Because they cut the wrong wire.
Exactly. The exact same prostaglandin pathway the drug blocked to stop joint pain also happened to play a crucial role in preventing blood vessels from clotting.
Wow. So parts of the inflammatory cascade are deeply protective.
Deeply protective. Biological pathways aren't binary. We saw a very similar tension with the CANTOS trial.
Wait, the one that proved inflammation causes heart attacks?
That's the one. Canakinumab proved the inflammatory hypothesis of heart disease, but it was never widely adopted in preventive cardiology.
Why not? If it stopped heart attacks, shouldn't everyone take it?
Because patients on the drug who survived heart attacks ended up dying at similar rates from fatal infection.
Oh, man. So the drug successfully lowered their cardiovascular risk, but it heavily blunted their immune system's ability to fight off environmental pathogens.
Precisely. You turn off the kitchen sprinklers so they stop rotting the floorboards, but now the house is completely defenseless against a new fire.
Okay, let's unpack this. Looking at all this, it's really easy to assume inflammation itself is the core enemy of the human body, or that if you have inflammation, you must have an underlying infection.
And both of those are dangerous misconceptions. Acute inflammation is vital. I mean, without it, the smallest scratch wouldn't heal, and minor infections would be uniformly fatal.
And what about the infection myth?
While infections are a major trigger, chronic inflammation is heavily driven by sterile triggers.
Sterile triggers, like things that aren't bacteria.
Right. Exposure to foreign materials the body cannot break down, like silica or asbestos. That forces the immune system to organize a cluster of macrophages into a physical wall called a granuloma, basically trying to permanently quarantine the threat.
Oh, so granuloma is just a wall of immune cells.
Exactly. And metabolic conditions are also entirely sterile. In obesity, excess adipose tissue actively secretes inflammatory cytokines. The fat itself acts as an endocrine organ, sounding the alarm, completely independent of any bacteria.
Which brings up the massive wellness industry built around curing this state. We're constantly bombarded with messaging about anti-inflammatory diets, superfoods, and supplements to fix the invisible fire.
Well, while diet and lifestyle absolutely influence systemic inflammatory markers, the clinical evidence that eating specific foods can meaningfully reverse an established chronic inflammatory disease is, frankly, far weaker than marketing suggests.
So what actually works?
The most effective evidence-based interventions require either highly targeted biologic drugs to interrupt specific cytokines or completely removing the mechanical trigger.
By removing the trigger, you mean like treating the H. pylori?
Right. Whether that is eradicating H. pylori with antibiotics, stopping smoking, or achieving significant weight loss to remove the metabolic strain.
So, why does all of this deeply layered pathology matter to you? Because it is the common thread tying together almost everything we fear as we age.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, chronic inflammation is the hidden driver in type 2 diabetes, in atherosclerosis, and in multiple sclerosis.
And isn't it actively being studied as a root cause of Alzheimer's disease?
It is. It is also a leading mechanism investigated in long COVID, where patients suffer persistent systemic symptoms long after the acute virus is cleared.
It's the exact reason your doctor orders a CRP test during a physical. It redefines how we view lifestyle choices. I mean, chronic stress, poor sleep, and obesity aren't just personal habits. They are mechanical triggers, continuously flipping the switch on a highly destructive immune response.
Ultimately, chronic inflammation is the ultimate biological double-edged sword. It represents the body's fierce, ancient desire to heal itself, locked in a dysregulated cycle that inevitably destroys the very tissue it is desperately trying to save.
Which leaves a profound question lingering in the background of all these sources. If chronic inflammation, whether sparked by the natural cellular damage of aging, excess visceral fat, or an unresolved infection, is truly the master mechanism behind almost every major disease of aging, does that mean human mortality isn't actually driven by 1,000 different biological failures?
That's a huge question.
Are we simply victims of one massive evolutionary blind spot? We are operating an immune system that brilliantly protects us against trauma and infection when we are young, but simply lacks the genetic programming to gracefully power down as we outlive our historical life expectancies. The invisible paper cut might just be the most important puzzle in modern medicine. Catch you on the next deep dive.